The winter of 1878 came down on the Grey River Valley like a hammer. It was not a gentle descent into slumber, not a quiet blanketing of snow, but a sudden, violent act of subjugation. The valley, a recent and optimistic scar carved into the high wilderness, was unprepared. Its people were hardy, but their knowledge was of a different, softer world. They had brought with them the architecture of rolling hills and temperate forests, building their cabins with the straight-backed, honest geometry of their homelands. They built them sturdy and square, with logs hewn from the seemingly endless supply of pine and fir. They chinked the gaps with moss and mud and believed themselves secure. They were wrong. The cold in that high country was not merely an absence of heat. It was an active, predatory force. It was a pressure, a physical weight that pressed against the log walls, seeking entry. It moved like a thief, finding the smallest flaw, the tiniest crack where the chinking had shrunk, the narrow space beneath a door. It did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest timber, radiating a deep, cellular chill that no fire could fully banish. The settlers' stoves, iron behemoths with insatiable appetites, roared day and night. They consumed cords of wood at an astonishing rate, turning seasoned oak and pine into fleeting warmth and a steady column of smoke that was whipped away by the relentless wind. The effort of staying warm became the singular, exhausting focus of every life in the valley. Inside the cabins, a strange and desperate ecosystem developed. Frost grew on the interior walls, delicate, crystalline ferns of ice that blossomed overnight in the corners farthest from the fire. A cup of water left on a table could be skimmed with ice by morning. Families lived in a tight orbit around their stoves, the only islands of comfort in a sea of pervasive cold. Children were bundled in so many layers they could barely move. The constant, gnawing draft was a familiar misery, a cold breath on the back of the neck, a whisper of the hostile world just inches away. The sound of an axe splitting wood was the valley's heartbeat, a frantic, unceasing rhythm against the silence of the snow. This struggle was universal. In the Miller cabin, at the north end of the settlement, young Mary Miller spent her days stuffing rags and dried grasses into the gaps between the logs, a futile battle against the wind that whistled through them. Her husband, John, was out from dawn until dusk, his axe a constant companion, his body aching with the labor of felling and hauling enough wood to see them through another 24 hours. Their newborn cried with a thin, reedy sound, a cry not of hunger, but of a cold that seemed to have settled deep in his tiny bones. They were doing everything they had been taught, everything that had worked before, in the places they had left behind. But the valley did not care about their past. At the other end of the cluster of cabins lived Silas Hemlock, the man who had overseen the construction of nearly every structure in the settlement. He was a master carpenter, a man whose hands understood the language of wood. His own cabin was considered a fortress, its dovetail joints so precise a knife blade could not find purchase. Yet even in Hemlock's home, the cold was winning. He stood by his window, a grim expression on his face, watching the snow swirl, feeling the chill that bled through the 2-foot-thick timber walls he had raised with his own proud hands. He had built according to the wisdom of generations, yet that wisdom was proving to be a fool's comfort. The valley demanded something more, something different, and no one knew what it was. The problem was not individual, it was collective. Their shared knowledge had reached its limit, and beyond that limit lay a vast and terrifying winter. Among them lived a woman named Ilara. She was a widow, a quiet figure often seen at the edge of the settlement, her gaze fixed on the distant, jagged peaks. Her husband, Liam, had been a geologist, a man of science and quiet intensity, who had been drawn to the valley not for its timber or fertile soil, but for its bones. He had died the previous spring, a victim of a sudden rockslide, while prospecting in the high canyons. His death had left Ilara adrift, a woman of books and quiet observation, in a world that valued loud strength and physical endurance. The community regarded her with a kind of pitying concern. They saw her as fragile, a scholar's wife, ill-equipped for the brutal realities of frontier life, a solitary woman with two small children, Caleb and Lena, to protect. They expected her to fail, or to leave when the snows receded. But Liam had left her more than just grief and two children to raise. He had left her his notebooks. They were thick, leather-bound volumes filled with his precise, angular script and detailed sketches. He had been fascinated by the way the natural world solved problems. He had pages on the insulating properties of snow, sketches of hibernating animal burrows, and complex calculations on thermal mass and wind dynamics. He had come from a land of high, cold mountains across the ocean, a place where the winters were even longer and more severe than in the Grey River Valley. He had written of the houses there, built not just of wood, but of earth and stone, structures that hunkered down into the landscape, that absorbed the sun's meager warmth and held it long into the night. He wrote of a simple, powerful principle. A wall that fights the wind will eventually break. A wall that deflects it will endure. As the first deep cold settled into the valley, Ilara saw the fear in her children's eyes and felt the familiar, insidious chill creeping into their small cabin. She watched her woodpile diminish with alarming speed. She saw the futility in her neighbor's frantic, repetitive work. And in the quiet hours of the night, by the light of a single candle, she read Liam's words. An idea began to form, a plan that was both radical and ancient. It was not a plan to build a new house, for she had neither the time nor the strength for that. It was a plan to transform the one she had. She would not fight the cold with more fire. She would shield herself from it with the earth itself. She would give her cabin a second skin. Her plan was to encase the entire structure, from the stone foundation to the eaves of the roof, in a thick coating of clay, straw, and horsehair. She would dig the clay from the riverbank, use the straw left over from the meager harvest, and gather the hair from the stable floor. She would mix these simple ingredients into a dense, heavy plaster and apply it layer by layer, creating a seamless, monolithic shell several inches thick. It was a method Liam had described, one used by his ancestors. The clay would provide immense thermal mass, a dense barrier that would absorb the heat from her stove and the warmth of the afternoon sun, holding it like a stone in a hearth. The straw would act as a binder and create countless tiny air pockets, a primitive but effective form of insulation. The final surface would be smooth and curved, offering no sharp edges for the wind to grip and tear at. It was an idea born of observation, a solution that worked with nature, not against it. When she began the work, the community's pity turned to bemusement, and then to open mockery. The first time Silas Hemlock saw her down by the river, digging the heavy gray clay into a wheelbarrow, her dress hitched up and her boots caked in mud, he stopped and shook his head. "What are you doing, Ilara?" he asked, his voice laced with the condescending patience one uses for a child. She explained her purpose in simple, direct terms. He listened, his brow furrowed, and then he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, but it was dismissive, the laugh of a man who knows his trade and cannot fathom such foolishness. "Mud?" he said, gesturing to her perfectly sound log walls. "You're going to cover good timber with mud? Woman, you'll seal in the damp. The logs need to breathe. You'll have rot and mildew come spring, I guarantee it. You're building yourself a tomb, not a home." He offered to send his son over to help her cut more firewood, the only sensible solution he could imagine. She politely declined. His opinion became the valley's opinion. Her project became known as Ilara's Folly. Men would stop by on their way to the forest, leaning on their axes and offering unsolicited, scornful advice. "That mud will crack and fall off in the first hard frost," one declared. "You're making a fine home for rats and nothing more," said another. The women were no kinder, whispering among themselves as she toiled. They saw her work as a sign of a mind unhinged by grief, a desperate, nonsensical act. The children, echoing their parents, would sometimes stand at a distance, chanting, "Mud Pie House, Mud Pie House," until Ilara's son, Caleb, would chase them away with a stick. The laughter followed her as she pushed the heavy wheelbarrow back and forth, from the river to her cabin, a constant, demoralizing chorus of doubt. But Ilara did not stop. She had Liam's notebooks, and she had the memory of the cold in her children's rooms. That was enough. The work was harder than anything she had ever known. Each morning she would rise before the sun, her body aching from the previous day's labor. She would feed the children, stoke the fire, and then head out into the biting air. The clay by the riverbank was dense and cold, a thick, sucking mire that fought her at every shovelful. It clung to her boots and clothes, a heavy, numbing weight. She would load the wheelbarrow until she could barely move it, her muscles screaming as she pushed the clumsy, single wheel over the frozen, uneven ground back to her cabin. There, she dumped the clay onto a large, rough-hewn mixing platform Liam had built for mixing cement. Then came the mixing. She would add water, pail by pail, and then fork in the dry, brittle straw. Finally, she would step into the mixture herself, her boots sinking into the cold, wet mass. For hours, she would tread the clay and straw together, the rhythmic squelch and pull of the mud a testament to her slow, unyielding progress. It was grueling, repetitive work. The cold from the clay seeped into her bones, a damp chill that the evening fire could never fully bake out. Her hands, perpetually wet and cold, became raw and cracked, the skin split around her knuckles. But with every batch she mixed, she thought of Liam's drawings, of the cross-sections showing how the layers would protect her home. She was not just mixing mud. She was building a shield. Once a batch was ready, the application began. She would scoop the heavy plaster onto a wooden hawk and press it against the log walls with a trowel, forcing it into every crack and crevice. She started at the foundation, building up a thick, solid base. She worked in sections, covering a few square feet each day. Her movements were not fast or elegant, but they were patient and precise. She learned the feel of the material, how much water it needed, how much straw would hold it together. She worked with a quiet, focused diligence that baffled her observers. They were used to the quick, decisive sounds of construction, the ring of an axe, the rasp of a saw. Her work was nearly silent, marked only by the soft scrape of her trowel and the wet slap of the mud against the logs. She worked alone, a solitary figure against the vast, indifferent landscape. Her small children, her only companions, watching from the window or playing near the woodpile. While Ilara toiled at her slow, strange task, the rest of the valley was a hive of conventional activity. The air was filled with the sharp crack of axes as men worked feverishly to build their woodpiles ever higher. They saw the dwindling stacks as a measure of their impending doom, and they fought it the only way they knew how, with brute force and relentless labor. Silas Hemlock, his earlier advice to Ilara ignored, spent a week meticulously re-chinking his own cabin. He used a traditional mixture of lime mortar and sand, painstakingly applying it to every joint, his work a model of the community's accepted wisdom. He finished the job in 5 days, his walls sealed and white, and looked with a mixture of pity and smug satisfaction at Ilara's cabin, still only halfway covered in its ugly brown coat. "She'll be lucky to finish one wall before the real snows come," he remarked to his wife. "And then she'll see what a fool's task she's set for herself." Others followed his lead. They patched and sealed, stuffed and insulated with the materials they had always used. Their preparations were a flurry of activity, a race against the coming winter. They finished their tasks, stacked their wood, and settled in to wait, confident in their time-tested methods. Their work was done. Ilara's, it seemed, was endless. Her cabin stood in stark contrast to the neat, orderly homes around it. It looked half-formed, a strange hybrid of log and earth, an architectural anomaly that offended the valley's sense of propriety. Her isolation was now physical, her home a visible representation of her separation from the community's way of thinking. She was surrounded by their finished work, by their certainty, while she continued her messy, solitary labor, guided by a dead man's theories and her own unshakable resolve. The genius of her method was in its details, details the mockers could never see. It was not just a layer of mud. Liam's notes had been specific. The north wall, the one that bore the brunt of the prevailing winter wind, received the thickest coating, nearly a foot of the dense, insulating mixture. She curved the corners of the cabin, creating a soft, rounded shape that would encourage the wind to flow around it rather than battering against it. This was a principle she had seen in the smooth, weathered stones in the riverbed. At the base, she flared the earthen wall outwards, creating a buttress that not only supported the weight, but also shed water and snow away from the stone foundation, preventing the deadly cycle of freezing and thawing that could destroy masonry. She was creating a system of nested layers. First, the original log wall. Then, an air gap she carefully maintained by pressing the first layer of mud only lightly into the deepest crevices. This trapped, unmoving air was a powerful insulator in itself, a concept Liam had sketched out with diagrams of animal fur and bird feathers. Finally, there was the thick outer shell of clay and straw, the thermal battery. During the day, its dark, earthen color would absorb any sunlight that broke through the clouds, storing that energy. At night, as the fire burned inside, the heat that inevitably escaped through the logs would not be lost to the wind. It would be caught and held by the massive earthen skin, creating a gentle, radiant warmth that would last for hours. It was a slow, passive system, the exact opposite of the valley's frantic consumption of firewood. It was a lesson in patience, a fortress built not of defiance, but of acceptance. The sky began to change in the first week of December. The usual gray palette deepened to a bruised, sullen purple that hung low over the mountain peaks. The wind, which had been a constant, howling companion for weeks, suddenly fell silent. A profound, unnatural stillness settled over the valley. The air grew heavy, and the smoke from the chimneys rose in perfectly straight, unwavering columns. The animals knew. The squirrels disappeared, the winter birds vanished from the bare branches. An ancient, instinctual dread settled upon the people. They had seen harsh weather, but this felt different. This was a prelude. Silas Hemlock stood on his porch, chewing on his lip. "This is a bad sign," he muttered to his wife. "The world is holding its breath." The storm arrived not with a roar, but with a whisper. It began as a fine, almost invisible dust of snow, so light it seemed to hang suspended in the air. But it did not stop. Hour after hour, the tiny flakes fell, accumulating with a deceptive speed. Then, as dusk fell, the wind returned. It came from the north, a solid wall of force that struck the valley with the impact of a physical blow. The whisper became a shriek, then a deep, guttural roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabins. The fine snow turned into a blinding horizontal blizzard, a white maelstrom that erased the world, reducing visibility to mere feet. The great white storm of '78 had begun its assault. Inside the Hemlock cabin, the fortress of the valley. The illusion of security shattered within the first few hours. The wind, a malevolent and intelligent beast, found every imperfection in his masterful construction. It forced the fine, sharp snow through the window casings and under the door. It screamed down the chimney, sending puffs of smoke and ash back into the room. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Hemlock and his family huddled closer to the stove, but the iron box, though glowing red-hot, seemed to be fighting a losing battle. The heat it produced was snatched away almost as soon as it left the stove's surface, pulled toward the freezing, groaning walls. Hemlock stuffed more wood into its mouth, then more again. The stove was no longer just heating the home, it was fighting the entire Arctic North, and its appetite was terrifying. The story was the same across the valley, only worse. In the Miller cabin, the wind tore at the rags they had stuffed in the walls, pulling them out and leaving gaping holes for the snow to pour through. Little drifts began to form on the floor. Mary held her baby inside her own coat, trying to shield him with her body heat, her face a mask of terror as she listened to the timbers of her home creak and moan under the strain. John stood helplessly, watching the woodpile he had thought so enormous shrink with every log he threw into the fire. The cold was no longer just a discomfort. It was a mortal threat, an invading army that had breached their defenses and was now laying siege to their very lives. The community, isolated in their individual wooden boxes, was collectively failing, their traditions and hard work proving utterly inadequate against the storm's fury. But in Alara's cabin, something strange was happening. Quiet. Outside, the same storm raged. The wind hammered against the house, the same tidal wave of force that was tearing at her neighbors. But her walls did not groan or creak. The thick, curved, earthen shell absorbed and deflected the wind's energy. The sound of its fury was muffled, reduced to a distant, hollow hum, like the sound of the sea heard from deep within a cave. There were no drafts. The seamless mud skin offered no cracks, no joints, no purchase for the wind to exploit. The windows, deeply recessed within the thick new walls, were protected from the direct blast. Inside, the air was still and calm. The temperature was not hot, but it was a steady, comfortable cool, a livable warmth that permeated the entire space. The walls themselves, which in every other cabin were surfaces of biting cold, were merely cool to the touch. The thermal mass of the clay was working exactly as Liam's notes had predicted. It was holding the day's accumulated warmth and the steady output of the stove, creating a vast reservoir of gentle heat. Alara fed the fire not with frantic desperation, but with a calm rhythm, placing a single log on the coals every hour or so. The stove burned with a steady, efficient flame, its heat being captured and stored by the house itself, not stolen by the storm. Her children, Caleb and Lena, were not huddled by the fire. They were asleep in their beds, under their quilts, breathing the calm, still air of a home that was at peace with the winter outside. For 2 days and 2 nights, the storm raged without pause. The valley disappeared under a blanket of white, the cabins reduced to snow-shrouded mounds, their existence marked only by the frantic plumes of smoke from their chimneys. On the 3rd morning, a temporary lull occurred. The wind eased its relentless assault, and the snowfall lessened, though the air remained brutally cold. In his cabin, Silas Hemlock made a grim calculation. His woodpile, which he had believed would last a month, was nearly gone. They had burned through weeks of fuel in just 2 days. The walls of his home were coated in a thick layer of interior frost, and the water bucket was frozen solid. He was a proud man, but he was also a practical one. He knew they would not survive another night like the last 2. He had to get more wood, or he had to get help. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned and stepped out into a world transformed. The snow was waist-deep, a vast, sculpted landscape of drifts and dunes. The cold was shocking, a physical pain that seared his lungs with every breath. He began the arduous task of wading through the snow toward the tree line, his eyes scanning the other cabins. He saw the desperate, thick smoke pouring from every chimney, a sign of the same battle he was losing. Then his eyes fell upon Ilara's folly. He stopped, confused. From her chimney, only a thin, lazy wisp of blue smoke curled into the air. It was the kind of smoke one saw on a mild autumn day, not in the heart of a killer blizzard. His first thought was a sickening one. Her fire had gone out. The widow and her children were dead. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had mocked her, and now she had frozen to death because of her foolishness. He changed course immediately, fighting his way through a massive drift toward her door, rehearsing the grim task of what he would find inside. He reached her door, which was half buried in a drift, and pounded on it with his gloved fist, shouting her name against the renewed howl of the wind. There was a pause, and then the door opened. A wave of air hit him, and he physically recoiled, not from a blast of cold, but from a wave of calm, steady warmth. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked stove, but a gentle, even heat that seemed to radiate from the very structure of the house. He stared, speechless, into the cabin's interior. Ilara stood there, holding the door, looking at him with concern. Behind her, he could see her children playing quietly on a rug in the middle of the floor, not bundled in coats, but in their normal indoor clothes. There was no frost on her walls. There were no frantic preparations. There was only a profound and impossible peace. He stumbled inside, pulling the door shut behind him. He was a man in shock. He took off his gloves, his fingers numb, and held his hands out, expecting to rush to the stove. But the warmth was everywhere. He walked to the wall, the north wall, the one that should have been a sheet of ice, and placed his bare palm against it. It was cool, but it was not the life-leeching cold of his own walls. It felt solid, inert, peaceful. He looked at her stove, where a small, calm fire flickered, consuming a single log with miserly efficiency. He looked at her wood box. It was still more than half full. He turned to Ilara, his face a mixture of disbelief, awe, and a deep, crushing shame. All his knowledge, all his experience, all his pride had been rendered worthless. The foolish widow in her mud hut had faced the storm and won, while he, the master builder, had been brought to his knees. Ilara did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat or offer any words of vindication. She saw the exhaustion and defeat in his eyes, and acted with simple grace. She gestured to a chair. "Silas," she said, her voice calm and even. "You look frozen through. Sit. I have broth on the stove." Her quiet triumph was not in words, but in this simple act of hospitality. It was in the steady warmth of her home, in the safety of her children, in the quiet confidence with which she faced the storm. She handed him a steaming mug, and as he wrapped his trembling hands around it, he finally understood. She had not built a foolish mud hut. She had built a fortress far superior to his own. She had listened to a different kind of wisdom, and it had saved her. In that moment, he knew he was not just in the warmest house in the valley. He was in the presence of its wisest mind. Word of the miracle at Ilara's cabin spread with the halting pace of men wading through deep snow. After Hemlock returned to his own home, warmed and nourished, he sent his eldest son to the miller's. The boy brought a sled with a precious load of Ilara's firewood and a story that was hard to believe. John Miller, desperate and seeing his own woodpile reduced to splinters, went himself. He found the same impossible scene, the calm, warm interior, the sleeping baby, the quiet hum of survival. He returned a convert. During every lull in the storm, which continued its assault for another 2 days, a small procession of defeated men made their way to Ilara's door. They came expecting to offer aid to a widow. They stayed to witness a revelation.
The laughter that had once echoed around her home was replaced by a stunned, respectful silence. They would enter, feel the warmth, see the evidence with their own eyes, and leave with a new understanding of the world. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a silent world of dazzling white under a painfully blue sky, Silas Hemlock was the first to return. He did not come with the swagger of the valley's expert builder. He approached her cabin slowly, his hat in his hands, his shoulders slumped not with cold, but with the weight of his own ignorance. He stood at her door, waiting for her to open it. He did not ask for firewood or for shelter. He looked her in the eye, the proudest man in the valley, and spoke the 3 most difficult words of his life. "Teach me how." It was a plea, a surrender, and a testament. It was the moment the entire community's mindset began to pivot. The old way had failed, spectacularly and dangerously. The new way, the strange, mocked, foolish way, had triumphed. He was ready to become a student. Ilara did not hesitate. She invited him in, cleared the table, and laid out Liam's notebooks. She asked for no apology, no payment, no praise. She saw a man who needed to learn in order to protect his family, and that was a motivation she understood perfectly. With her children playing at her feet, she opened the books and began to explain. She showed him the drawings of wind currents flowing over curved surfaces. She pointed to the calculations for thermal mass, explaining how the clay walls acted like a reservoir for heat. She traced the diagrams of the layered insulation, showing the importance of the trapped air. She spoke of the earth not as dirt, but as a building material, ancient and effective. She shared her knowledge as freely and generously as she had shared her warmth, transforming her personal victory into a communal gift. Silas Hemlock, the master carpenter, sat and listened, his calloused hands tracing the delicate drawings, his mind slowly grasping the revolutionary simplicity of it all. That spring, as the immense drifts of snow finally melted back into the earth, the Grey River Valley was transformed into a massive work site. A spirit of communal effort, born of shared hardship and newfound humility, took hold. Under Ilara's quiet guidance and Hemlock's newly energized direction, the settlers began the great work of cladding their homes. The riverbank became a place of community labor, as men, women, and children dug the clay together. The sounds of mockery were replaced by the sounds of cooperation, the rhythmic squelch of dozens of pairs of boots mixing the earthen plaster, the shared grunts of lifting, the scrape of trowels working in unison. They worked through the summer and into the autumn, racing the approach of the next winter. Each cabin in the valley, from the miller's small home to Hemlock's once proud fortress, was given its own protective earthen skin. The very look of the settlement changed. The sharp, angular lines of the log cabins softened into curved, organic shapes that seemed to grow from the landscape itself. The village no longer looked like an imposition on the land, but a part of it. They were no longer fighting the valley, they were learning to belong to it. When the first snows of 1879 began to fall, there was no panic. There was a quiet confidence, a shared sense of security that had been utterly absent the year before. The winter came, harsh and deep as always, but inside the homes there was warmth and there was peace. The story of the valley's transformation traveled. A federal surveyor, charting the remote territories the following year, was forced to winter in the settlement. He arrived expecting hardship and privation, but instead found a thriving community
warm and well-fed. He was astounded by the simple genius of the Valley Method, as he called it in his official report. He spent weeks sketching the designs, interviewing Alada and Hemlock, and documenting the precise mixture of the plaster. His report, and the stories he told to anyone who would listen, spread the idea beyond the confines of the Grey River. Settlers in other high-altitude, cold-weather frontiers began to experiment with the technique. The Quiet Widow's solution, born of a dead man's notes and a mother's resolve, rippled outwards, saving untold lives from the ravages of winter in places she would never see. Years passed. The Grey River Valley prospered. The children who had chanted "Mud Pie House" grew into adults who raised their own families in the warm, safe, earth-clad homes. The wood tax that winter demanded became a manageable tithe, not a crushing burden. Alada became the quiet, respected heart of her community, a woman whose wisdom was sought on all matters, not just building. She never boasted, never reminded anyone of their earlier scorn. Her vindication was written on the landscape itself, in the enduring warmth of every home. The story taught a lesson that was passed down from one generation to the next, that the harshest environments often yield the most profound wisdom, but only to those who are humble enough to look for it in unexpected places. It was a lesson about the triumph of quiet observation over loud tradition, and of the enduring strength that can be found not in fighting nature, but in understanding its powerful, silent language.